I spent 34 years as my family's invisible ATM, the quiet daughter who never caused trouble, but always cleared their debts. My reward arrived at 6 in the morning on a Saturday. Before my coffee was even poured, my sister texted a blunt demand for $7,200 to fund a lavish Sweet 16. She attached photos of a crystal ballroom and a ridiculous custom cake. I didn't panic. My auditor brain simply woke up. If you've ever been your family's wallet, drop your city in the comments, because this story ends with a completely different kind of receipt. I stared at my phone screen as if it owed me a rational explanation. Tammy never sends standard invoices. She sends glossy, vibrant pictures, and she lets the pictures do all the heavy lifting. The photo of the venue came with a short caption, "Mia deserves this." Then came the dress photo. Then the cake photo, complete with a little heart emoji, as if a digital heart could somehow make the $700 price tag feel softer. She did not send this to me privately. She sent the entire sequence to the main family group chat, which was a very specific kind of message. Within 1 minute, Sandra replied, 3 clapping hand emojis and the word, "gorgeous." Denise, my aunt, followed up immediately with a row of red hearts. Nobody asked how a single mother with maxed out credit cards was going to pay for a gala. Nobody had to ask that question, because in my family, that question has only ever had one answer. The answer has always been me. If it were a private text, I could simply type, "No." In a group chat, I am performing for an audience. They were not asking if I would pay. They were waiting to see how quickly I would surrender. I set the phone face down on the granite counter and let the coffee machine finish its cycle. I told myself to breathe evenly. I am an auditor by trade. When other people look at a grand party, they see balloons, streamers, and dancing. I see line items. I see vendor deposits, final balances, and hidden fees. I always know exactly whose account that money has to come from. I picked the phone back up. $7,200 for a single night. It was not just the audacity of the number that struck me. It was the flat, unquestioning expectation. It was a demand dressed up as an invitation. Somewhere under my ribs, a familiar pressure began to build. This was not the first time a picture had shown up before a bill. It was not the 10th time. By the time anyone in this family actually talks about money, the non-refundable deposit has usually already been paid. The only question left hanging in the air is who will be forced to cover the rest. The group chat was silent now. They had laid the emotional trap, and now they were waiting for me to step directly into it. I had never let myself do the actual math on my family. Doing the math would mean admitting there was an ugly pattern, and admitting there was a pattern would mean I had to finally do something about it. So, for a decade, my only strategy had been blind avoidance. The folder was opening. The timing of this text was the one thing Tammy did not know. Nobody in the family knew, because I had deliberately chosen not to tell them. In my family, you do not get to be proud of your own achievements out loud unless it is about someone else. If I ever mentioned my financial success, it would only be viewed as an open vault waiting to be raided. To Tammy and Sandra, I was simply the older sister with the good job who was doing fine. Fine was a tailored costume I had worn for so long they truly believed it was my actual skin. 2 weeks earlier, I had finally started the strict paperwork on a condo. It was not a sprawling mansion. It was a modest 2-bedroom unit on the east side of town. It had a minor leak under the kitchen sink and a clear view of a crowded parking lot. But to me, that quiet space was a cathedral. I had been renting terrible apartments since I was 22 years old. I had been meticulously saving for this exact down payment since I was 26. Every corporate bonus, every tax refund, every skipped vacation went into a separate account. It was the only account in my life with a heavy mental padlock on it. My loan officer had been exceptionally clear during our last meeting. She sat across her desk, reviewed my pristine credit history, and folded her hands. "Keep the cash reserves exactly where they are. Dana," she warned me, "do not take on any new debt, do not co-sign a loan, and absolutely do not move large sums of money around before your closing date." In other words, I was strictly forbidden to do the exact thing my family had trained me to do on command. They did not see the master spreadsheet on my laptop where every single dollar had a specific name and a job. They did not know that $7,200 was not a casual favor I could just absorb into a monthly budget. It was the exact difference between signing my closing papers in March and losing the entire property. It would have to come straight out of the one account that was supposed to be the very first thing in my life that was only mine. That was the part that finally turned the key in my mind. It was not the ridiculous designer cake. It was not even the high dollar amount. It was the terrifying fact that they were reaching, without even knowing it, for the exact drawer I had spent 8 years learning to keep securely shut. I looked around my cramped apartment. The dream was mine. I picked up my phone and dialed Tammy's number. I kept my voice perfectly level and professional. Over the years, I have learned that the calmer I sound, the more room people give themselves to say the true thing. I did not start the conversation with a rejection. I started it exactly like an auditor. I asked her, just casually, what the real total budget for the party was. I said it twice, making sure to frame it as a simple request to see the whole financial picture. There was a long pause on the line. It was the specific kind of pause Tammy utilizes when she is deciding how much of a lie to hand you. "Why does it matter?" she asked, her voice dipping into sudden defense. "Family takes care of family. Dana, that is just what we do." There it was. The entire religion of my childhood house packed into one sentence, delivered so gently it almost sounded like ancient wisdom. But family taking care of family never actually meant all of us taking care of all of us. In our house, it only ever meant the ones who can, must carry the ones who will not. And everyone calls it unconditional love. So nobody has to call it parasitism. I asked again, my tone even softer. "How much is the venue? Tammy, how much is the dress? What has already been put down?" Tammy sighed loudly into the receiver, clearly painting me as the difficult sister. "You already handled the venue deposit. Remember back in the fall? So really, it is not even that much more." I sat very still at my kitchen island. The air in the room seemed to freeze. I did remember. Sort of. I remembered it the way you remember a strange dream that turns out to have been real. It was a quick, breathless phone call in late October. A credit card number read out loud over the phone in the middle of my busy workday so Mia would not lose her ideal date. "You will get it back by Friday." Tammy had sworn. I had said, "Sure," and then closed the mental folder. I had completely forgotten it. It was exactly like forgetting a splinter until you press hard on it. Now she was pressing on it. I opened my banking application, scrolling back through months of old statements with a cold, professional dread. And there it was. $1,500. A pending hold on my primary credit card, under my own name, for a ballroom I would never dance in. The splinter was deep. You have to understand how a financial hostage situation like this gets built over time. Nobody hands you a 10-year bill all at once. If they did, you would run for the door. Instead, it comes one just this once at a time. The very first one I can vividly remember was Tammy's broken car transmission. It was a freezing afternoon in February, 8 years ago. Mia was only 6 years old, sitting in the back of a dead sedan in a grocery store parking lot. The mechanic wanted $900. Tammy called me sobbing hysterically. "Just this once. Dana," she pleaded. "I have no one else to ask." And she was right. I was the only one. I transferred the $900 before I even let myself feel the pull of it leaving my account. Feeling it would have meant admitting there was a pattern forming. Admitting there was a pattern would mean I had to confront the people I loved. So, I employed my entire survival strategy. I just did not count. This is the cruel trap of normalization. When a family member asks for a massive sum, your internal alarms ring wildly. But when they ask for a towing fee here, a security deposit there, or an overdue phone bill, they absolutely swear they will repay by the 15th. The boundaries blur. Each request arrives wrapped in urgent kindness and disguised as a temporary, unavoidable crisis. They rely entirely on your empathy to override your logic. You pay because the amount feels small enough to make refusing seem petty and cruel. Before you know it, their personal emergencies become your permanent monthly subscriptions. That first transmission repair was the cornerstone of the fortress they built around my wallet. After that, it was a credit card balance that had somehow magically climbed past $4,000 while Tammy was not looking. Then it was medical bills, school trips, and late fees. I kept all the digital receipts in a hidden folder on my desktop that I never, ever opened. It was exactly like keeping a smoke detector in the hallway that you just blindly assume is working. You never want to press the test button, because the noise might shatter the peace of the house. I had normalized my own exploitation. I had taught them that my personal boundaries were entirely negotiable if they just applied the right amount of emotional pressure. They learned the lesson perfectly. The normalization was complete. People often assume I paid for everything simply because I had a good salary. That is the easy answer. And for a long time, I let my family believe it. It painted me as generous and fortunate. But it is not the true answer. The true answer is much smaller and far more painful. I paid because when I paid, I actually mattered to them. I grew up as the older sister in a cramped house where money was always tight and emotions were always terribly loud. Sandra and Arthur spent all their daily energy trying to keep the lights on and managing Tammy's dramatic teenage rebellions. Somewhere along the way in that chaotic environment, I learned a quiet, devastating lesson. The absolute surest way to be needed was to be entirely useful. Tammy was the daughter people constantly worried about. I was the daughter people constantly relied on. Those are not the same thing at all. And the second one is much lonelier than it looks from the outside. When you are the reliable one in the family, nobody ever checks on you to see if you are okay. They just check to see if you are currently available to fix a mess. So, I made myself permanently available. I paid the venue deposits. I fronted the credit card holds, and I kept my mouth tightly shut. I did it because as long as I was the solitary pillar holding the family roof up, I never had to find out the terrifying truth. I never had to find out if they would still want me sitting at the table if I put the heavy burden down. That was the unspoken contract I had signed with my own bloodline. Being the ultimate fixer felt incredibly close to being loved. I confused their gratitude for genuine affection. When Sandra would sigh in deep relief after I cleared a debt, or when Arthur would silently pat my shoulder, I mistook their financial relief for parental warmth. I never once let myself wonder what my actual worth was in that house, if I ever stopped fixing their mistakes. I was terrified of becoming obsolete. Tammy extracted love by taking up all the emotional space in the room. I bought their love by giving up all my hard-earned resources. Neither of us believed we could just be loved plainly, for absolutely nothing, without a financial transaction securely attached. I stared at the bank statement on my phone. The illusion was breaking. Before you decide that Arthur is simply a cruel man who enjoys extorting his eldest daughter, you need to understand a quiet scene I witnessed 2 Christmases ago. It is a memory that completely changed how I hear his voice, even now when he makes his heavy demands. I had walked into the small back den of their house looking for a misplaced phone charger. Instead of an empty room, I found Arthur sitting at the cramped wooden desk tucked right under the frosted window. His reading glasses were pushed low down his nose. He was holding a credit card statement in his trembling hand. It was not his statement. I recognized the bright red logo immediately. It was Tammy's overdue bill. Arthur was slowly, methodically writing a personal check against his own retirement pension account. That specific account was supposed to last him and Sandra for the rest of their natural lives. He was filling out the amount the exact same way a desperate man pays a terrifying ransom. He moved quickly, quietly, clearly hoping that nobody would walk in and catch him in the act of financial surrender. He looked up, startled, and locked eyes with me. For a long, suffocating minute, neither of us said a single word. He simply slid the glaring statement under a glossy magazine, and I slowly backed out of the doorway. Arthur, the man who constantly preaches that family takes care of family, has been quietly drowning in the exact same toxic water he keeps pushing the rest of us into. He was not the original author of this destructive rule. He was just its oldest and most faithful servant. He had been raised in a house even poorer than the one he raised Tammy and me in. In his childhood, the only acceptable way anyone ever said they loved you was by handing over cash they absolutely could not spare. He had carried that flawed language into every single year of his adult life, as if it were the only tongue he knew how to speak. He is not malicious. He is just fundamentally afraid. He believes, all the way down to his bones, that the very day the checks stop clearing is the day his daughters will stop coming home for the holidays. Knowing that painful truth made the trap I was currently standing in feel even more suffocating. The financial demands were never actually about a party, a broken car, or a late bill. They were about purchasing proximity. He bought Tammy's presence by paying her debts, and he secured my presence by making me the ultimate savior. We never spoke of it. I drove out to Millage early the next morning. Millage is a quiet, fading town about 40 minutes from my apartment. The kind of place with one good diner and a lot of empty storefronts. It is the kind of place where everybody knows exactly whose children turned out fine and whose children are struggling. I thought if anyone would stand with me, it would be my parents. Though deep down, my auditor instincts knew the historical data did not support that optimistic projection. Before I even reached the front door, I saw Mia. She was sitting alone on the cold concrete porch steps, waiting for me. She would not have been out there in the morning chill if she just wanted a simple ride somewhere. She is 15 years old, all sharp elbows, dark eyeliner, and a quiet watchfulness that reminds me painfully of myself at that exact same age. I sat down right next to her on the freezing concrete. For a long while, neither of us said anything. We just watched a neighbor's dog pace along a chain-link fence across the street. Then, without looking up from her worn sneakers, Mia spoke. "You do not have to pay for it, Aunt Dana." I turned my head and asked her to clarify what she meant. She began picking nervously at the frayed hem of her oversized sweater. "The party," she whispered. "I know it is a lot of money. I heard Sandra and Tammy yelling on the phone last night. Tammy told her she did not even want the grand ballroom." I sat in stunned silence as Mia systematically dismantled the entire foundation of the emergency. She explained that she just wanted a handful of her actual friends in a backyard. Maybe some cheap string lights and a homemade cake. She did not want the 400-person guest list her mother had obsessively built out of distant cousins, old co-workers, and local acquaintances. Most of the invited guests were people Mia had never even met in her entire life. She looked up at me, her young face completely devoid of typical teenage entitlement. "It is not really for me," she said flatly. The illusion was finally over. My teenage niece had successfully figured out at 15 what it took me 34 years and a massive folder full of receipts to accurately name. The extravagant ballroom party was never actually about celebrating her 16th birthday. It was entirely about Tammy needing to definitively prove something to a community that measures human worth strictly in dollars spent. Tammy needed to prove that she loved her daughter the most, and she needed to do it on a grand stage. Mia was just going to be the convenient, smiling excuse for a $7,200 bill that she had never once asked for. I reached over and put my arm firmly around Mia's shoulders. She leaned into me, which she almost never lets anyone do anymore, sitting on those cold, unforgiving steps. I made a completely different internal decision than the one I had driven out with. I was no longer going to try and negotiate a reasonable budget for the venue. I was not going to protect the extravagant party, and I was not going to protect Tammy's fragile ego. I was going to protect the kid. And those, I was finally starting to understand, were two very different, violently opposing things. Tammy's primary strategy for a decade had been to use a child as a human shield. She never came at me with direct anger when asking for funds. She always came at me holding a picture of Mia, because a vulnerable child is the one thing I have never, in my entire life, been able to confidently say no to. Tammy knew that. Sandra knew that. Arthur knew that. They had weaponized my basic human decency against me. But looking at Mia's tired, anxious face, the auditor in me took full control of the narrative. I refuse to sign any binding document just because someone is artificially rushing me. And I absolutely refuse to fund a toxic cycle that teaches a young girl she is nothing more than a high-priced prop for her mother's social media performance. I gave Mia a gentle squeeze, told her everything was going to be handled properly, and walked back to my car without ever stepping foot inside Sandra and Arthur's house. I chose the kid instead. That night, back in the quiet sanctuary of my apartment, I found myself completely unable to sleep. The silence of the rooms was usually my comfort, but tonight it felt heavy, thick with pending consequences. I paced the hardwood floors for an hour before I finally decided to do the one thing I had actively avoided for 10 years. I walked over to the top shelf in my home office and pulled down the thick, unmarked manila folder. If your phone only ever lights up when a family member desperately needs a check, you already know exactly what this specific feeling is. It is the distinct, paralyzing dread of finally adding up a thing you have spent years making absolutely sure you never had to look at. I carried the heavy folder to the kitchen island like it was an active explosive device. It contained bank statements, printed screenshots of old text messages, and a few handwritten, worthless promises from years back when Tammy still bothered to pretend she would repay me. I walked over to the machine and brewed a strong cup of dark coffee at midnight, functioning exactly like a woman preparing for a grueling overnight audit at a hostile corporate firm. I carried the steaming mug back to the island and opened my laptop. A physical folder is just a messy collection of emotional guilt, but a pristine spreadsheet is an undeniable fact. And I was officially done having chaotic feelings about this situation. I needed hard data. I opened a completely fresh, blank document on my screen. The blinking cursor felt like a challenge. I told myself that checking the math would be cold, and that counting the favors would be a cruel betrayal of family loyalty. That was the exact lie Sandra and Arthur had successfully planted in my brain. Real families do not audit each other, they would say, but a family that had raised me to believe that was simultaneously attempting to send me a massive bill and disguise it as a birthday celebration. The dread slowly evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, sharp clarity. I finally broke the seal. I set up the spreadsheet with meticulous precision. Column A was designated for the exact date. Column B was for the stated reason of the emergency. Column C held the precise dollar amount. And column D was labeled for the amount repaid. I knew, with a sinking certainty in my stomach, that column D was going to be a very lonely place. I started at the very beginning, with the infamous transmission repair from February 8 years ago. $900. I typed it in. Then I moved forward, one documented crisis at a time. I adamantly refused to let myself round the numbers down. I refused to let myself soften a single figure to make the reality less harsh. I entered the security deposit for Tammy's second apartment, then the multiple cell phone bills she swore she would cover by the 15th of the month. Then the massive check I had written to clear her credit card the frantic summer Mia broke her arm on a playground. Line after line, the rows populated. Each entry was relatively small on its own. Each one had arrived wrapped in the same urgent, desperate kindness, completely closing my mental folder a little tighter every time I clicked transfer. The loan for the unreliable car that eventually broke down and became an entirely different car loan. The emergency grocery runs. The electric bill shutoff notices. The rapid, breathless phone calls in the middle of my workdays. As the rows stretched past 50, then past 80, the glowing screen cast a pale blue light across my steady hands. I did not feel angry as I typed. The anger had burned off hours ago. I felt the pure, detached focus of an investigator uncovering massive corporate fraud. I was tracking the systematic dismantling of my own financial future. The final entry was the venue hold from October, $1,500. I highlighted the entire column, took a slow sip of my black coffee, and clicked the auto-sum function. Column D remained completely empty. Around 1 in the morning, I finally stopped typing. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, stiff and cold. The apartment was entirely silent, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I moved the cursor to the bottom of the meticulously populated spreadsheet and looked at the running total calculating in the corner of the screen. For a long, suspended moment, I could not make my hand move to scroll down and see the final digits. I knew it was going to be bad, but the brain always tries to protect itself from the exact dimensions of a disaster. When I finally let myself see all of it, the number was $41,360. That was the grand total extracted from my accounts over 10 years and a few odd months. Not one single dollar of it resided in column D. I sat perfectly still in the harsh blue light of the screen. I did not cry. Crying was a chaotic feeling, and I had permanently retired my feelings for the night. I just stared at the undeniable facts. $41,360 is not just a random figure. It is a reliable used car paid entirely in cash. It is 2 solid years of a child's college tuition. It is the vast majority of a standard down payment on a 2-bedroom condo with a minor leak under the sink. I had effectively purchased my family a beautiful house I would never be allowed to live in, one $900 emergency at a time. I had done it so efficiently and so quietly that they had genuinely come to believe the money simply appeared out of thin air. Here is what the glowing ledger taught me that no amount of emotional therapy ever had. I had not actually been helping them. Genuine helping has a distinct end date. Helping makes someone stronger, stabilizes their situation, and then gracefully steps back so they can walk on their own. What I had been doing had absolutely no end built into its structure, because deep down, I had never wanted it to end. An ending would have meant finding out who I was to these people when I was not handing over my debit card. I had been fully funding a toxic, unsustainable way of life and politely calling it unconditional love. They had been eagerly accepting it and calling it the exact same thing. The noble word had served as a convenient cover for all of us for an entire decade. But standing in my dark kitchen, looking at the safest, most terrifying number I had ever calculated, the fog completely lifted. The pressing question was no longer whether I could afford to keep paying. The question was what I was going to do with $41,000 worth of undeniable proof. The truth was absolute. There was one more crucial piece of information the spreadsheet revealed to me, and it was the specific detail that changed my entire situation from a quiet grief into an actionable plan. As I had meticulously rebuilt the last 12 months line by line, I was forced to pull up the actual vendor contracts to get the exact amounts right. That is when I noticed whose name was printed in bold ink at the top of the agreements. The venue holding deposit for $1,500 was on my primary credit card. It was under my legal name, secured with a confirmation number that ended in my own initials, because I had read it out myself on a rushed Tuesday afternoon. But it was not only the grand ballroom. Tammy had also put a preliminary deposit down at an upscale bakery in early October. When her card inevitably declined, she had texted me in a fabricated panic, and I had simply given her my secondary card number just to secure the hold. $300, my card. Then came the dress. The $400 floor-length dress Mia was wearing in the fitting room photo was sitting on an active layaway plan at an exclusive boutique. I opened the digital receipt. The layaway plan was registered in my name, too. Because, of course, it was. You have much better credit, Dana. They will approve you instantly. Tammy had reasoned months ago. I sat back in my ergonomic office chair, processing the heavy reality of the paperwork. For 10 long years, I had viewed myself as the family's passive wallet. A wallet is simply opened on demand. It is an inanimate object that resources flow out of, constantly depleted by the hands that hold it. But a wallet possesses absolutely no inherent power. A signatory does, somewhere in the thick fog of a decade of urgent favors. I had unwittingly become the sole person legally attached to the very extravagant party I was currently being ordered to fund. The financial holds were entirely mine to place, which meant, I realized slowly, with the cold, exceptionally clean feeling of a ledger finally balancing out, that the holds were also entirely mine to release. I had not just been blindly paying for Tammy and Sandra's poor choices. I had been actively standing as a human shield between them and the natural consequences of those choices. My signature was the only structural support holding their entire grand illusion together. And a legal name you gave without fully meaning to is a legal name you can cleanly take back. I held the keys. Before I did anything drastic, I attempted to do the reasonable thing. I need you to understand that I deliberately gave them a clear, open door before I ever reached for a padlock. At 8 in the morning, I sent Tammy a carefully drafted text message. It was calm, measured, and entirely professional. It was the exact kind of correspondence I would send a corporate client whose quarterly numbers did not add up. I told her that I loved her, and that I deeply loved Mia. I stated clearly that I wanted Mia to have a wonderful 16th birthday. Then, I offered a compromise that I genuinely believed was more than fair. Let us sit down together, I typed, just the two of us, and build an actual, itemized budget. We can plan something beautiful that Mia would actually love and that we can both comfortably afford. I will contribute a set, transparent amount. No more surprise deposits. No more sudden holds. I read the message over twice before hitting send. I felt a brief, foolish surge of hope. I was offering to be generous on purpose, rather than being generous by ambush. I thought maybe, if she could just see that I was not rejecting her daughter, we could build something healthy. I waited for her response. It had not yet occurred to my logical brain that a budget, to my family, was not a practical solution. To them, a budget was a profound insult. Tammy did not text back. She called me. She only calls when she wants to ensure I hear her voice physically break. So that is it. She sobbed into the receiver, her tone dripping with manufactured betrayal. I am just a line item to you now, your own sister. I calmly clarified that I was suggesting we plan the event together as equals. Together, she repeated, spitting the word out like a toxin. You want me to justify my child's existence to you like I am applying for a bank loan. To me, proposing a budget was a profound sign of respect. It meant I took her seriously as an adult. To Tammy, it was an aggressive accusation. It was proof that I coldly viewed the family as columns to be balanced instead of people to be unconditionally indulged. She hung up on me before I could utter another word. The reasonable door I had gently pushed open had just been slammed shut from her side. Have you ever tried to set a boundary, only to be violently accused of destroying the family? Let me know in the comments. Because what Arthur did next left me with zero doubts. The war had begun. 10 minutes after Tammy abruptly ended the call, my phone vibrated across the kitchen island. The screen boldly displayed Arthur's name. I knew instantly, before I even accepted the call, that he was reaching out to permanently seal the door Tammy had just slammed. Arthur never raises his voice. He never yells. And that is precisely what makes him so terrifyingly effective. A man who refuses to shout can effortlessly make you feel like you are the one being completely unreasonable simply for having a pulse. Dana, he said. His voice was warm, incredibly tired, and heavy with manufactured disappointment. It was the exact tone he historically uses to end complex discussions. This nonsense has gone far enough. He did not ask to hear my perspective. He did not mention the practical budget I had just offered his younger daughter. That meant Tammy had immediately called him, delivered her hysterical version of the events, and he had swallowed it whole. He always accepts her version, because her version never demands anything from him except my money. And my money is a language he deeply understands. He proceeded to explain the dynamics of our family to me as if I were a slow child who had willfully forgotten the foundational rules. I was the eldest daughter. I possessed the lucrative career. This was exactly what the strong members of the tribe did. They carried the weak. They smoothed over the rough edges. They made the expensive birthdays miraculously happen. Your sister struggles daily, he lectured softly. You do not. That is not her fault, and it is not yours. But it means you are the one who has to provide. I stayed completely silent. Silence is a remarkable tool. It forces people to step into the empty space and reveal the truest version of their intentions. After a prolonged, uncomfortable moment, Arthur finally said the sentence that will echo in my mind for the rest of my life. His warm tone did not even harden. Pay up, Dana, or you are no longer family. There it was. The absolute price of my membership. Finally itemized and spoken out loud by the patriarch who had established the currency. Not, we will be hurt. Not, we will be disappointed. It was immediate, permanent excommunication. I had been paying $41,000 over 10 years to silently avoid the exact penalty he had just named. I did not argue. I did not cry. I simply replied, "Okay, Arthur," in a voice so steady it surprised us both. I tapped the red button to end the call. The contract was broken. After receiving a sentence like that from a father, Most normal people would completely fall apart. They would sink to the kitchen floor, weep into their hands, and mourn the sudden loss of their entire support system. I want to tell you that I did exactly that, because it would make me seem much more relatable and human, but I did not. Instead, I did the precise thing I do at the firm when a catastrophic number emerges that threatens to invalidate an entire corporate audit. I got very, very calm. This is the strange, protective gift of the auditor. When the environment becomes overwhelmingly loud and chaotic, my internal systems go entirely quiet. I systematically separate the raw feeling from the hard figure. I force myself to look at what is actually true underneath all the emotional noise. So, I sat rigidly at my kitchen table and performed that mental operation. The feeling my father had just threatened to permanently erase me from his life. The figure I had a financial decision to make regarding $7,200. And the clock was aggressively ticking. I let the feeling sit in one chair, and I pulled the figure into the other. If I surrendered and paid the massive bill, what exactly would I be purchasing? I would not be buying a beautiful party. I certainly would not be buying Mia's genuine happiness, because she had explicitly told me she despised the event. I would simply be buying another decade of this exact extortion. I would be funding another 10 years of silent favors that never received a repayment entry. I would be guaranteeing another late-night spreadsheet, years down the line, with a grand total even more devastating than $41,000. Arthur had not actually threatened me. He had simply made me a very clear, transactional offer. The terms were completely unambiguous: keep paying the invoices, and you get to stay in the family. For the first time in my adult life, I allowed my brain to logically finish the thought he had initiated. What kind of family charges an admission fee? What kind of conditional membership can only be renewed with a high-limit credit card I had spent 34 years paralyzed by the fear of being cast out? Sitting there, as cold and balanced as a reconciled ledger, I finally evaluated the institution I was so terrified of losing. The investment was worthless. I turned away from the glowing spreadsheet and opened my encrypted email archive. I needed to verify the exact parameters of the trap I was currently standing in. I located the original PDF contract for the grand ballroom reservation that Tammy had forwarded to me back in October. When you are deeply entangled in a toxic family dynamic, your primary instinct is usually to argue, to plead, or to try and logically explain your profound hurt. But emotional arguments are entirely useless against people who view your boundaries as an insult. The only thing that effectively dismantles manipulation is a binding legal process. This is the ultimate power of documentation, a concept my family had actively trained me to ignore. They relied entirely on verbal guilt and unwritten obligations. But a credit card authorization is not a vague emotional promise. It is a rigid financial contract. When you place a hold on an account, you are not handing over cash. You are providing a legal pledge, backed by your own pristine credit, that the vendor can capture the funds at a specified later date. Because my name, my signature, and my personal card number were the sole anchors holding that pledge in place, I retained the absolute unilateral authority to revoke it. I scrolled down to Section 4.2 of the venue agreement. The fine print was incredibly clear. The holding deposit secured the coveted date. But the massive remaining balance was due in full exactly 72 hours prior to the scheduled event. If the balance was not actively paid or alternative arrangements made, the card on file would be automatically charged. I checked the calendar on my desk. The automated 72-hour billing window was rapidly approaching. If I waited even one more day to desperately try and make Tammy or Arthur understand my perspective, the automated billing system would process the catastrophic charge. The machine did not care about my childhood trauma, my down payment on the condo, or Arthur's cruel ultimatums. It only cared about the authorization. If I went to sleep tonight without taking definitive action, the extravagant party would become my permanent, non-refundable financial burden. The window for a peaceful, negotiated exit had officially closed when Arthur hung up the phone. I had to execute the cancellation immediately, utilizing the cold, precise mechanics of the banking system. The clock was ticking. I placed the printed contract down on the kitchen island and picked up my smartphone. It was exactly 4 minutes past 11 at night. My hand was surprisingly steady. I dialed the venue's dedicated after-hours customer service line. After 3 long rings, a bored young man named Kevin answered the phone. I could clearly hear him chewing on what sounded like a late-night sandwich. It was a bizarrely mundane setting for the most pivotal turning point of my entire adult life. I gave Kevin the specific confirmation number. I provided my full legal name, confirming it matched the name explicitly printed on the primary credit card holding the reservation. He clicked around on his keyboard for a moment, swallowed his food, and asked how he could assist me. I took a slow, deep breath of the quiet apartment air. Then, I said the definitive sentence I had been walking toward for 10 years and $41,000. I need to cancel the entire reservation. Kevin paused his chewing. He asked me if I was absolutely certain, launching into a mandatory script about the terms. The initial $1,500 deposit from October was strictly non-refundable. The reservation would be released immediately, and the highly desirable date would go straight back onto their open public calendar. I told him I completely understood and officially authorized the cancellation. He typed for a few seconds. "Okay, ma'am, that is successfully canceled. You will receive an automated confirmation email shortly." He hung up to finish his meal. And just like that, the grand ballroom simply ceased to exist. I did not stop there. I immediately called the upscale bakery's voicemail system and left a clear, documented message canceling the massive designer cake, citing my name and the primary card number. Finally, I logged into the exclusive boutique's online portal and manually terminated the active layaway plan for the floor-length dress, fully forfeiting the initial deposit. 3 distinct, methodical actions, 11 total minutes. A decade of playing the silent, suffering financial martyr ended in less time than it takes to fold a load of laundry. I set the phone back down on the cold granite counter. I felt an enormous, expansive stillness settle over my shoulders. The holds were gone, but the explosion was coming. Hit subscribe if you want a front row seat to the 7:30 morning kitchen table. The fire was lit. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. I spent the early morning hours printing out the comprehensive spreadsheet, ensuring every single line item from the past 10 years was perfectly formatted and clearly legible. I slid the pristine stack of papers into the heavy manila folder. I showered, dressed in my sharpest, most professional tailored suit, and left my apartment before the sun had even fully breached the horizon. I wanted to be there before the daily chaos began. The drive to Millage was quiet and entirely uneventful. I watched the dark sky slowly turn a bruised shade of purple, then a pale, forgiving pink. I pulled into Arthur and Sandra's cracked concrete driveway at exactly 10 minutes to 7. I have never once been late to a professional appointment, and I was certainly not going to be late to my own resignation. I shifted the car into park and looked through the windshield. Tammy's massive, gas-guzzling SUV was already parked haphazardly on the front lawn. Of course she was already there. Tammy has a distinct operational pattern. Whenever she initiates a massive conflict, she immediately drives over to the house at dawn to strategize with Arthur. She gets there first to securely establish her victim narrative and guarantee he is fully armed to defend her before I can even walk through the door. It is a brilliant, highly effective tactic she has utilized since we were teenagers. I sat alone in the driver's seat for one final minute. I slowly drank the last warm drops of my terrible gas station coffee. I looked at the warmly lit windows of the house I grew up in. For 34 years, walking up that specific concrete path meant walking into an emotional minefield where I was completely blindfolded. But today, the profound fear was entirely absent. For the absolute first time in my life, I already knew every single number on the board, and they did not even realize the game had changed. I picked up the heavy manila folder from the passenger seat, stepped out into the crisp morning air, and walked up the familiar steps. I turned the brass knob. I let myself into the house using my old key. The kitchen was thick with the heavy scent of brewing coffee and burning toast. Arthur was sitting at the head of the wooden table, his reading glasses perched on his nose, sternly reviewing a newspaper. Sandra was standing at the sink, nervously wringing a damp dish towel. Tammy was sitting across from Arthur, aggressively typing on her smartphone, her face twisted in a mask of calculated distress. The entire room felt like a staged courtroom waiting for the defendant to arrive and beg for mercy. I walked in quietly. "Good morning," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any recognizable emotion. I walked over to the edge of the table and set my keys down. I placed the manila folder next to them, squaring the edges perfectly parallel to the table. Arthur lowered his newspaper, preparing to deliver another booming lecture about my familial duties. Tammy opened her mouth, inhaling deeply to start her orchestrated sobbing. But before either of them could utter a single syllable, the digital universe intervened. It was exactly 28 minutes past 7. Tammy's phone, resting face up on the table, emitted a sharp, high-priority chime. The screen lit up brilliantly. Because I was standing right next to her, I could easily read the bold subject line of the automated email before she even touched it. "Reservation canceled. Action required." Tammy snatched the phone up, her eyes scanning the brief text. I watched a violent weather system of profound confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror rapidly cross her face in the span of 2 seconds. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice cracking for real this time. She looked wildly at Arthur. "The venue. The grand ballroom. It says the reservation has been officially released." Arthur froze. Sandra dropped the damp towel onto the linoleum floor. The kitchen fell into a suffocating, suspended silence. I looked directly into Tammy's panicked eyes. "I canceled the holds that were securely in my name," I said calmly. "All of them. Last night." The illusion shattered instantly. The quiet kitchen instantly erupted into absolute chaos. Tammy lunged forward, slamming her hands down on the table. She came at me exactly the way she always does, incredibly loud, wildly dramatic, and completely certain of her own absolute righteousness. "You ruined it," she shrieked, her face turning a blotchy red. "You waited until the absolute last second, and you ruined your own niece's sweet 16 just to make some sick, twisted point. You are a bitter, lonely woman who cannot stand to see anyone else be happy." Her voice bounced off the kitchen cabinets, sharp and punishing. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood perfectly still, letting the sheer volume of her panic wash over me without absorbing a single drop of it. I watched her perform her outrage, realizing with absolute clarity that she was not mourning a birthday party. She was violently mourning the sudden loss of her limitless ATM. Arthur abruptly stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "That is enough. Both of you," he commanded. But his angry eyes were locked entirely on me, not on the daughter who was currently screaming her lungs out. I understood in that fleeting moment that in this house, the phrase "both of you" has only ever meant Dana. He was maintaining his false equivalence, blaming me for disturbing the peace by simply refusing to be robbed. Sandra immediately began to weep, rushing forward and putting a trembling hand on my arm. "Dana, honey, please," she begged, her voice high and thin. "We can still fix this. If you just call them back right now, we can fix this." The word fix tasted like ash in the air. I knew exactly what my mother meant. Fixing it did not mean addressing Tammy's toxic behavior or Arthur's cruel extortion. Fixing it meant I simply needed to open my wallet and make the uncomfortable conflict disappear. I looked at Sandra's desperate face, then at Arthur's furious glare. I did not raise my voice. I waited for the silence. I waited in absolute silence until the frantic noise simply ran out of gas in the small kitchen. I waited until Tammy was breathing heavily, her chest heaving with performed indignation. I waited until Arthur's face turned a deep, concerning shade of crimson, and Sandra had both hands pressed tightly over her mouth to muffle her anxious whimpers. When the room was finally quiet enough to hear the hum of the refrigerator, I placed 2 fingers on the heavy manila folder. I slowly slid it across the smooth wooden table, stopping right in the center where everyone could see it. "Before anyone says another word about fixing the situation," I said, my tone as level as a freshly poured foundation, "I want everyone in this room to clearly see what we have actually been fixing for 10 years. Nobody reached for the folder. They stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. So, I reached out and opened it myself. I turned the thick stack of printed spreadsheets around so they could read the columns right side up, and I laid the pages out completely flat. It was 10 years of my family's conditional love, meticulously rendered in a currency they had sworn we never, ever counted in. The transmission repair, the security deposits, the overdue utility bills, the credit card bailouts, row after row of undeniable data, and at the very bottom, printed in bold black ink, was the final total: $41,360. I watched 4 faces go completely pale in a kitchen that had spent a decade loudly insisting we were the kind of family that did not keep score. I looked directly at Tammy, whose expression had crumpled into genuine shock. "I paid for all of it, Tammy," I said. "The grand ballroom, the designer cake, the boutique dress. Those were on my personal credit card, in my legal name, this entire time. And every single line on these pages is me, too." Arthur made a low, strangled sound in the back of his throat, but I kept going, my voice perfectly steady. "I am not showing you this spreadsheet to hurt you," I explained. "I am showing you because I love you all too much to keep lying to you about what I have actually been doing." I shifted my gaze toward the hallway. Mia had quietly come down the wooden stairs at some point during the shouting. She was standing in the doorway, listening to the absolute truth, her bright eyes filling with tears. I looked back at Tammy. "I did not cancel the reservations because I stopped loving Mia," I said firmly. "I canceled them because I finally started." The ledger was finally open. For a brief, suspended second, I thought the undeniable weight of the data had finally ended the war. But desperate people do not surrender to facts. They search frantically for a loophole. Tammy's eyes darted wildly around the room before a sharp, manic laugh suddenly escaped her throat. It was the sound of a woman who genuinely believed she had just outsmarted an auditor. "You really think you hold all the power, Dana?" she sneered, grabbing her smartphone off the table and waving it at me like a weapon. "You think you can just cancel my daughter's 16th birthday and walk away? I am not stupid." I called Kevin at the venue's management office first thing this morning. I used Arthur's social security number and his pension account details to officially authorize the reinstatement of the contract. The party is still on. You just lost your deposit for absolutely nothing. Sandra let out a massive sigh of profound relief, collapsing back against the counter. Arthur's shoulders instantly dropped. They thought they had successfully bypassed my boundary. They thought the old, comfortable system had miraculously restored itself. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice. I had already anticipated this exact frantic maneuver. I calmly reached into my tailored suit pocket, pulled out my own phone, and dialed a number. I pressed the speakerphone button and set it firmly on the spreadsheet. "Marcus," I said when a deep, professional voice answered. "It is Dana Cisco. I am sitting here with my sister, Tammy. Could you please clarify the current status of the ballroom reservation for next Saturday?" Marcus, the senior regional manager I had escalated my cancellation to late last night, cleared his throat. "Certainly, Ms. Cisco." His voice echoed loudly in the silent kitchen. "As we finalized at midnight, your reservation was permanently voided. A woman claiming to be your sister did attempt to reinstate the booking this morning using a different gentleman's financial credentials. However, our corporate policy strictly prohibits transferring a canceled hold to a secondary party without the original cardholder's written consent. Furthermore, that specific date was instantly rebooked by a corporate client at 6 o'clock this morning. The ballroom is completely unavailable." I tapped the screen, ending the call. The silence that followed was absolute. There was no magical loophole. There was no emotional override. The rigid, unforgiving architecture of legal contracts and financial compliance had effortlessly crushed Tammy's desperate manipulation. Tammy stared blindly at her phone, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. She slowly sank down into her wooden chair, entirely defeated. There was no magic left. There was no cinematic reconciliation in that kitchen. Nobody suddenly stood up, hugged me, and tearfully admitted that I was entirely right. When you force people to look directly at a truth they have spent a decade actively avoiding, they do not thank you for the illumination. They resent you for turning on the harsh lights. Arthur stood up, turned his back to the room, and walked silently out the back door, letting the screen door slap shut behind him. Sandra sat down heavily at the table, burying her face in her trembling hands. I did not attempt to comfort them. I did not apologize for the discomfort. I simply picked up my car keys, left the thick manila folder resting squarely on the table, and walked out the front door. The weeks that immediately followed were incredibly quiet, and I will not pretend they were not profoundly lonely. The Family Telegraph Network, efficiently operated by Denise, immediately went to work. Within 48 hours, I was officially established in various living rooms across the state as the heartless, greedy daughter who had viciously abandoned her struggling family over money. I let them firmly believe it. I have learned the hard way that you absolutely cannot correct a false narrative in a house that desperately needs you to be the villain. They needed a villain to expertly distract themselves from the $41,000 truth sitting on their kitchen table. If my sudden absence was the necessary price for my financial and emotional freedom, I was finally willing to pay it in full. I stopped answering the passive-aggressive group texts. I stopped transferring small sums to cover emergency utility bills. I essentially became a ghost in the family architecture. And as I stood in my quiet apartment, absorbing the heavy weight of that chosen isolation, I realized something remarkable. I felt completely whole. I was no longer the reliable wallet. I was no longer the silent fixer. I was no longer the strong one assigned to carry the weak. The heavy, invisible armor I had worn for 34 years had finally cracked and fallen away. I was finally just me. The harsh winter slowly gave way to a remarkably mild March. On a crisp Tuesday morning, I took an approved half-day off from the accounting firm and drove to a polished law office downtown. I sat across a massive mahogany table from a notary public and a real estate attorney. They slid a mountain of complex legal documents toward me. I picked up the heavy blue pen and began to sign my name. This time, my signature was not securing a ballroom for a teenager who did not want it. It was not authorizing a layaway plan for an overpriced dress. Every stroke of the pen was building my own tangible future. My financial reserves sat exactly where the strict loan officer had demanded: untouched, secure, and entirely whole. My credit score remained pristine, completely unburdened by the chaotic, swirling debt of my extended family. After 30 minutes of continuous signing, the attorney smiled warmly and handed me a small, heavy brass key. I drove straight to the east side of the city. I parked in the crowded asphalt lot and walked up to the second floor. I unlocked the heavy door and stepped inside. The two-bedroom condo was completely empty. The air smelled faintly of fresh paint and old wood. I walked into the modest kitchen and checked the cabinet under the sink. The minor leak was exactly as the inspector had noted. I did not feel the urge to immediately call a repairman. I did not feel the need to urgently fix it for anyone else. I sat down right in the middle of the bare living room floor, crossing my legs on the cheap carpet. The afternoon sun streamed through the uncurtained windows, casting long, golden geometric shadows across the room. Sitting there alone, wrapped in absolute uninterrupted silence, I finally let myself cry. The tears came fast and heavy, spilling down my cheeks and spotting my silk blouse. But they were not tears of grief for the family I had walked away from. They were tears of profound, dizzying vertigo. The future was actually mine. The cathedral was officially mine. Tammy eventually had to aggressively scale the 16th birthday party down to match her actual, verifiable reality. Without my limitless credit card acting as a safety net, the grand ballroom was permanently lost. The massive 400-person guest list of distant relatives and random coworkers was entirely scrapped. According to the quiet rumors that filtered back to me through an old family friend, the event was relocated to the tiny, overgrown backyard behind Tammy's rented duplex. She bought cheap string lights from a local hardware store and ordered 20 boxes of generic cheese pizza. There was no designer cake shaped like stackable boxes, just a standard sheet cake from a neighborhood grocery store. There were exactly 30 teenagers in attendance, all of whom were Mia's actual, genuine friends from high school. Tammy explicitly and loudly forbade anyone from inviting me. I was strictly banished from the premises. It was a calculated wound, designed to punish me for closing the vault. I allowed myself to feel the sting of it, but it was a remarkably clean hurt. Late that Saturday night, while I was quietly organizing my new kitchen cabinets, my phone vibrated on the counter. It was a text message from an unsaved number, but I recognized the cadence immediately. It was Mia. The message contained a single, slightly blurry photograph. In the image, Mia was standing under the cheap, glowing string lights in the dark backyard. She was wearing a simple denim jacket, holding a slice of pizza, and laughing harder than I had ever seen her laugh in my entire life. She looked radiant. She looked like a normal, unburdened 15-year-old kid. Below the photograph, there was a short, simple caption typed out: "Wish you were here, Aunt Dana." I stared at the bright screen, tracing the outline of her smile with my thumb. I had not paid a single, solitary dollar for that specific party. And it was, without any question, the most genuine love my family had ever managed to construct out of the least amount of money. The best night cost nothing. 4 months passed since the dramatic confrontation in Arthur and Sandra's kitchen. Summer officially arrived, bringing a thick, humid heat to the city. I was standing in my own kitchen, making a cup of coffee using my own machine, when my phone chimed. It was another text from Mia. She had recently secured a part-time job selling tickets at the local movie theater, and she had just opened her very first independent savings account. The message was not asking for a favor, a loan, or a bailout. She wanted to know if Aunt Dana could possibly teach her how to properly set up one of those complicated spreadsheets on a laptop. There was a costly science trip to Washington, D.C. Her school was planning for the upcoming spring. Mia wanted to mathematically figure out the exact real number she needed to save before she even thought about asking Tammy for a single dime. I read that text message and had to slowly sit down on one of my new bar stools. This was the absolute core of the entire struggle. This was the heavy, generational chain finally breaking one vital link early enough to actually matter. I had not just saved my own down payment. Mia was going to grow up fundamentally knowing that genuine love and a strict budget are not mortal enemies. She was going to learn that you can look straight at a hard, cold number and still be generous, still be kind, and still be a family. I typed back, telling her to come over on Sunday, and that I would show her exactly how to balance the columns. Love that obsessively keeps a running balance out of spite is not truly love, but love that blindly refuses to ever check the balance is incredibly unsafe. I had spent $41,000 never quite learning that vital lesson. Now, I finally know exactly how to hold both. And, God willing, so will Mia. If you have ever been the family ATM, the quiet one they only call when their own cards decline, then you already know the heavy truth. Sometimes, the most profoundly loving word in the entire human language is a calm, unwavering no. If this story reached something deep inside you, share it with the person who desperately needs the courage to review their own ledgers, close the folder for good,